Good morning and good afternoon. I thought it would be interesting to read a little bit from some of the early Buddhist teachings in the Pali Canon. And I'd particularly like to recommend this book, In the Buddha's Words. It's edited by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it really is a wonderful book. I've read the book, and it's also available on Audible as a book you can listen to, which I've been doing. And there's sort of a difference in flavour a little bit between the Pali Canon and the way we often talk in Zen. But this is the foundation which our Zen practice is built. It's built on the foundation of these early Pali texts. And so the Buddha, after his enlightenment, his early teachings strongly sort of emphasized the sources of suffering, like why we suffer, and in a very practical way looked at what are the sources of our suffering. And in the Zen tradition, we don't often speak about it quite so directly. So when the Buddha spoke about the inevitability of sickness, old age and death, in Zen we're more likely to say something like, practice as if your hair is on fire, or don't waste time. You know, we just often say it in a different way, but it comes from these foundational teachings of the Buddhas. So I'd like to read some of the introduction because it kind of gives a good overview, and then if we have time, just one of the suttas, one of the short suttas. And I'll sort of read a paragraph and then maybe say a few things. Like other religious teachings, the Buddha's teaching originates as a response to the strains of the heart of the human condition, the strains at the heart of the human condition. What distinguishes his teachings from other religious approaches to the human condition is the directness, thoroughness, and uncompromising realism with which he looks at these strains. The Buddha does not offer us palliatives that leave the underlying maladies untouched beneath the surface. Rather, he traces our existential illness down to its most fundamental causes, so persistent and destructive, and shows us how these can be totally uprooted. However, while the Dharma will eventually lead to the wisdom that eradicates the causes of suffering, it does not begin there, but with observations about the hard facts of everyday experience. Here too, its directness, thoroughness, and tough realism are evident. The teaching begins by calling upon us to develop a faculty of careful attention. The Buddha asks us to stop drifting thoughtlessly through our lives, and instead to pay careful attention to simple truths that are everywhere available to us, clamouring for the sustained consideration they deserve. That's a really powerful introduction, first paragraph of the introduction. And I like this use of the word responds to the strains at the heart of the human condition, because nobody gets out unscathed from troubles. Troubles, we have troubles every single day. And how big those troubles loom in our mind and how much they dominate our experience is the sort of subject of the Buddha's early teachings, how to be with the strains of everyday life and have that actually not be a problem, even when it is, conventionally speaking, a very big problem. But how to be with it as if it's not actually really a problem, it's just how it is. And some of the strains are the external particularities of our life, But a lot of the strains are the way in which we perceive ourselves and the way we perceive others. Sometimes the word dukkha is just translated as a restless unsatisfactoriness. I think a lot of people have just an undercurrent of restless dissatisfaction with who they are or what's going on around them, what's happening in their lives. It doesn't always have to be loud suffering. So strains at the heart of the human condition. That's how it's translated here or described here. And the Buddha's teaching says that these strains can be totally uprooted. I think for most of us, they're probably not going to be totally uprooted, but they could be if we practiced sincerely enough. There's absolutely no reason why any of us can't totally uproot this restless dissatisfaction that we feel, or acute moments of extreme resistance to reality. But we do need to practice. It's not going to happen. I was listening to Tenzin Palmo. She's a Tibetan practitioner originally from England who spent 12 years in a cave, and there's a book about her life, Cave in the Snow, and she's quite blunt. She says people don't wake up because they're lazy. You just have to put in the work. You put in the work, you wake up. If you don't, you won't. I mean, you might if you're extremely lucky, because of various circumstances. Sometimes the external world thrusts so many difficulties upon us that we wake up from the force of them, if we respond to them in a skillful way. So when I heard her say that, like, it's just laziness, I was like, oh, I think we're going to add evening zazen to our routine. And so we've added evening zazen to our schedule. It wasn't the only thing that influenced me to do that, to suggest that, to decide to do that. It was definitely a little, her words penetrated my chest. Her words went in, they sunk beneath the skin. One of the most obvious and inescapable of these truths is also among the most difficult for us to fully acknowledge, namely that we are bound to grow old, fall ill and die. It is commonly assumed that the Buddha beckons us to recognize the reality of old age and death in order to motivate us to enter the path of renunciation leading to nirvana, complete liberation from the round of birth and death. However, while this may be his ultimate intention, it is not the first response he seeks to evoke in us when we turn to him for guidance. The initial response the Buddha intends to arouse in us is an ethical one. By calling our attention to our bondage to old age and death, he seeks to inspire in us a firm resolution to turn away from unwholesome ways of living and to embrace, instead, wholesome alternatives. And the Buddha was saying this in his 30s. It's not as if he was old and then suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm going to die soon. He was quite a young man, but he emphasized that we should be aware, just, we don't have to be thinking about it specifically every minute, but just to have a deep awareness of the fragility of our lives and of everybody's lives. And the fragility of objects, the fragility of everything. Everything is subject to decay. Everything falls apart. And when we really understand that everything falls apart, actually, it doesn't create a morbidness. For myself and for many others, the effect of really recognizing that fragility is just to fall in love with everything, to really appreciate things. I think about this with my own body. As many of us know, I do a lot of building. I'm building a mud brick house at the moment, and so my body needs to work a lot. You know, I need my hands and my muscles and my back to be able to do the heavy lifting, and I'm really aware that it could stop at any point, like tomorrow or this afternoon. Something could happen. Like, I do have a bit of a shoulder injury. Shoulder injuries are risky things. They can sometimes be very, they can become pretty permanent or require surgery. So I'm kind of aware. But being aware of the fragility of our body, the effect that it can have is to just be so grateful for every day that it's working. We should not take for granted that our eyes can see and our ears can hear, and that our arms can move, and that we can swallow. Sometimes when people are in the very late stages of their life, their capacity to swallow becomes so diminished that they can't take in water. And then their throat becomes dry and their tongue becomes dry. And I think people really appreciate saliva at that point. So we should appreciate saliva every day. We don't have to think about it in a strong way, but just a sense of loving this body that we have, not clinging to it for our happiness, because obviously that would be a bad idea, because it's not going to continue to always work for us, but just to appreciate it, just to deeply appreciate it. That's what contemplating sickness, old age and death does. It actually leads to appreciation. Again, the Buddha grounds his initial ethical appeal not only upon a compassionate feeling for other beings, but also upon our instinctive concern for our own long-term welfare and happiness. He tries to make us see that to act in accordance with ethical guidelines will enable us to secure our own well-being both now and in the long-term future. His argument hinges on the important premise that actions have consequences. If we are to alter our accustomed ways, we must be convinced of the validity of this principle. Specifically, to change from a self-stultifying way of life to one that is truly fruitful and inwardly rewarding, we must realize that our actions have consequences for ourselves, consequences that can rebound upon us, both in this life and in subsequent lives. There's an emphasis here on ethics, and that we're not wanting to just free ourselves from our own restlessness, but we want to be of benefit to others, to help liberate them from their restlessness, from their suffering, from their unnecessary suffering, and unnecessary as in self-generated suffering. We also want to help liberate people just from the suffering of daily life. And to realize that when we actually turn our focus really towards benefiting other beings, the side effect of that really is an inner mental peace, a happiness, a sense of satisfaction and rightness in ourselves. When people are preoccupied with just their own self-concern and wanting to satisfy their own particular needs and wants, more to the point, actually it doesn't work. It just never ends. And we know this. This is spoken about in all religious traditions, really. If you just keep trying to make your own life better, it's like being on a treadmill. You just keep going, keep going, keep going. Whereas the opposite happens when you just reach out and be kind to others in your own mind as well as in your actions. there is an immediate reward. There's an immediate sense of connectedness and a kind of ease that comes from that. The realization that we are bound to grow old and die breaks the spell of infatuation cast over us by sensual pleasures, wealth and power. And here sensual pleasures extends to all sorts of ways in which we try to comfort the body, comfort our minds. It dispels the mist of confusion and motivates us to take fresh stock of our purpose in life. We may not be ready to give up family and possessions for a life of homeless wandering and solitary meditation, but this is not an option the Buddha generally expects of his householder disciples. Rather, as we saw above, the first lesson he draws from the fact that our lives end in old age and death is an ethical one, interwoven with the two principles of karma and rebirth. The law of karma stipulates that our unwholesome and wholesome actions have consequences, extending far beyond this present life. Unwholesome actions lead to rebirths in states of misery and bring further pain and suffering. Wholesome actions lead to a pleasant rebirth and bring future well-being and happiness. So just that can be also commented on here, because sometimes people get a little hooked about what they think about rebirth. It's also fine to think about rebirth here in terms of tomorrow. You know, if I do a helpful action today, I feel the immediate positive effects of that, and I will also feel it tomorrow and the next day. Everything we do has consequences for us. It's like planting seeds in the storehouse consciousness. It influences the way we function in the world tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So you can hear it that way if that's a little more comfortable to hear it that way. And past lives can also be thought in terms of what I did yesterday, what I did the day before, what I did the day before that, what my parents did, what my parents' parents did, what my culture has done, what my country has done, what my country will do, what my community will do. These are ways that we can think of past lives and future lives. And we can think of them as rebirths in the traditional way as well. Since we have to grow old and die, we should be constantly aware that our present prosperity, the present prosperity we might enjoy, is merely temporary. We can enjoy it only as long as we are young and healthy, and when we die, our newly acquired karma will gain the opportunity to ripen and bring forth its own results. We must then reap the due fruits of our deeds. With an eye to our long-term future welfare, we should scrupulously avoid evil deeds that result in suffering and diligently engage in wholesome deeds that generate happiness here and in future lives. So another way too to think about this, the fruits of karma will ripen in the future, is if I do a harmful deed now, I might not in this particular body harvest the long-term effects of it, but somebody else will. Like whatever I do that's harmful, like say I speak in a way that encourages warfare, somehow the influence of that, it may play out in a conversation somebody has with their family in a few weeks' time, which influences the way that person votes, which influences the way money is spent by government and so on. So there's this rippling effect, and we can think of rebirth this way. When we think of ourselves as intimately connected with everyone, but then whether we personally feel the fruit or whether someone else feels the fruit, we don't want someone else to suffer the fruit of our misdeeds. But that's probably going to happen. So really, the thing is to keep remembering the fragility of everything, and therefore the magnificence of everything, the reason to care for everything because it's so fragile. So there's a term that is used here, it's translated in English as the uninstructed worldling. And this is a way of describing the person who hasn't examined their own mind, the uninstructed worldling. We come across quite a lot of variations of this. Sometimes it's called the common person or the common man. The unexamined person, the ordinary person. And it's important, I think, when we hear these translations to understand it's not saying anything about a whole group of people. It's really just describing that, unfortunately, most people do not really closely examine their minds. Most people just don't. And in that sense, the common person doesn't. But it's not saying there's a group of common people that don't and then there's a group of us who somehow magically do. It's just that, unfortunately, most people don't examine their minds closely. And when we don't examine our minds closely, then we're likely to inevitably really just follow habits and patterns passed on to us. And those habits and patterns tend to have a fairly high aspect of dualistic logic to them. So we're inevitably going to do harm in various ways, even if we don't particularly intend to. It's just accidentally we do. So here the translation is the uninstructed worldling, which I kind of like. So both the worldling and the noble disciple, so a noble disciple is just the opposite. It's someone who, in this instance, has encountered the Dharma and has a practice and is studying the teachings. But of course it could also be someone who is a really genuine, deep practitioner in another faith. We don't want to elevate Buddhism specifically above other traditions. So anybody who has got a deeply genuine practice, contemplative practice, with an ethical kind of compass, that's a noble disciple. So both the worldling and the noble disciple experience painful bodily feelings, but they respond to these feelings differently. The worldling reacts to them with aversion and therefore, on top of the painful bodily feeling, also experiences a painful mental feeling, sorrow, resentment or distress. The noble disciple, when afflicted with bodily pain, endures such feeling patiently, without sorrow, resentment or distress. It is commonly assumed that physical and mental pain are inseparably linked, but the Buddha makes a clear demarcation between the two. He holds that while bodily existence is inevitably bound up with physical pain, such pain need not trigger the emotional reactions of misery, fear, resentment and distress with which we habitually respond to it. Through mental training, we can develop the mindfulness and clear comprehension necessary to endure physical pain courageously, with patience and equanimity. Through insight, we can develop sufficient wisdom to overcome our dread of painful feelings and our need to seek relief in distracting binges of sensual self-indulgence. And I think most of us have heard the story of the second arrow. We're struck with the first arrow when something happens that we have no control over. Could be a physical thing, like an injury. But I think it can also include, things like losing your job or someone you love passing away or someone we love being in pain. These are the first arrows that happen. They happen to everybody. And they're painful enough. And so the Buddha's teaching is that we can actually maintain a kind of steadiness even with these first arrows. Which of course doesn't mean we wouldn't grieve. Of course, when someone we love passes away, then we're going to grieve. But there is a way of grieving that doesn't involve a kind of resistance to reality. It's just when we love someone deeply and we lose them, of course, it will be sad. But what often happens, probably for the majority of people, which is why we have these terms like the common person, the ordinary person, is we shoot ourselves with a second arrow. We add mental anguish on top of the event, whatever the event was. We add a whole lot of thoughts about it. We add our opinions about it. We add our resistance. Thoughts like, so unfair, it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened to me, it shouldn't have happened to them. And that second arrow, I was listening to Thich Nhat Hanh speak about this the other day. He was saying not only does that second arrow, twice as painful, like the first arrow hurts, the second arrow also hurts. He says that second arrow, that mental arrow, is often 10 times worse than the first arrow, or 100 times worse than the first arrow. I can see a little person there with Scott. There's a little person. Little people are so great. Hello, little person. Oh, he's waving back. Yeah, so it's the second arrow where we have enormous volition with that second arrow, to not shoot ourselves with it. Or at the very least to notice, oh my gosh, I've shot myself with the second arrow, I can't seem to help it. I'm going on and on and on about it. At least we can see that, and that's a little bit like when we at least recognise when we're being unskillful. That's a little bit like sort of an antiseptic or an anaesthetic. It sort of starts to reduce the pain. As soon as we recognise what we're doing, we start to reduce the pain. When we recognise the folly of it. Well, I was going to read some of the sutta, but I think maybe I'll do that next week because, I think I'll stop here and I'll just make a mark so I know where I got to. We'll continue this topic next time. It's about there. So, I was wondering if anyone would like to ask anything or comment. Or if there's a story from the early Pali Canon that you'd like to share, that'd be interesting too, any that you've also read or heard about. Francis?
I'm just reflecting on when I drive, I'm quite quick to get cranky with other drivers. And quite often I actually even say something, and sometimes Archer, who's 12 years old, is in the car as well, which is not so good. And then later I think, oh, I shouldn't be doing that. So I think it's that kind of like the arrow of someone's done something that I perceive to be very silly, and then me reacting to it and then going, oh, what are we doing?
Yeah.
But maybe at least I'm seeing what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're doing it sort of lightheartedly, fairly light, then I don't think it's like, I often say like, hurry up. I'll say something like that. Like, the lights are going to change, hurry up. And I'll say that aloud too, to the car in front of me. Come on, come on, come on. Or something like that. But yeah, but if it's like, you know, like got a mean-spirited quality to it, yes, or an actual angry feeling to it, then yeah, that's going to flow on, that's flowing on to Archer.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's that's a way of like thinking about rebirth. That's one way. You've just passed it on a little bit now. It's already started another life in another person. But then to be too self-critical about it, like to then, we could then shoot another arrow by going, oh my God, I've been meditating for 2 years and look what I'm still doing. You know, now we're just doing it again, you know. So it's just, you know, a certain lightheartedness, sort of a sincere lightheartedness, if you know what I mean. And we're always doing that with our practice. You know, not being too hard on ourselves, but also life is short, you know. We don't want to waste time. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, let's finish with our chant. I'll just turn the recording off.